7 o'clock, start an hour earlier, but again in this room, with Mark Segoff talking about biotechnology and the environment. This series of lectures on these topics of values and technology are sponsored by the Philosophy Club, the Institute of Physical Research and Technology, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the GTE Lectureship Program, the Iowa Humanities Board, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and finally, last but not least, the Committee on Lectures, funded by GSB. So we thank all of those groups for helping to make this possible. Tonight it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker. When I got my job here in Iowa 10 years ago, I really didn't have the concept in my mind of what a land-grant university was, or what that meant even. And I was fortunate to have someone turn me on to a book called America by Design, Science, Technology, and the Rise of Corporate Capitalism by Professor David Noble. And I read that book, and it talked about Iowa State. It mentioned Iowa State in the context of the land-grant universities and why those things were founded. And I felt before I came out here that I knew a little bit about our university. And nothing I've learned in the 10 years since has persuaded me that Professor Noble's line on places like Iowa State was wrong. Since then, he's also written other studies on the connection between the university system and industry, corporate capital. He wrote a book called Forces of Production, which is a study of how MIT and other universities, the role they played in developing computer numerical control. And that's going to be mostly his topic tonight. He has a couple of other books that I'd like to also mention, coming out at your book stand shortly. Okay, one's coming out in this January and February entitled Automation, Progress Without People. And that's coming out on Single Jack Press Books. And then next fall, fall 91, there'll be a book called World Without Women, Clerical Culture and Western Science, published by Knopf Press. So we're looking forward to those books. Professor Noble is not just an academic. A few years ago, he co-founded with Ralph Nader an organization called National Coalition for Universities in the Public Interest, which is really the only organization there is out there monitoring the interlocks between industry and the university. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor David Noble from Drexel University.
Thank you. I'm just trying to reorient myself. I just came from the demonstration outside. Maybe some of you just came also. It's a demonstration, a rally recognizing the problems of violence and hate, and in particular violence against women. And let me make a transition to talk about technology, which on the face of it seems a little remote, by talking about violence against women and technology. Probably the most important example of the political and cultural control of technology is occurring right now. I'm not talking about nuclear weapons, and I'm not talking about pesticides. I'm not talking about nuclear power and automobile safety, all of which are very important. I'm talking about RU-486. Has anyone heard of RU-486? This is a wondrous breakthrough in technology. The abortion pill, invented in 1980 in France, perfected, tested for its safety. It would save hundreds of thousands of lives around the world annually. And that technology is not being deployed. In 1980, when it was perfected, soon thereafter, as I said, it was tested. Countries throughout the world, China, various countries in Europe, made orders of this, for this technology, prepared their own governments for the testing of them. And then in 1988, the forces, I will call them the fanatic anti-abortion forces, led by the most powerful institution in the history of the West, namely the Catholic Church, was able to stop the introduction of this technology, this life-saving technology, in France and worldwide. What happened in France, you might know, is the government of France ordered the company to dispense the technology anyway, and it's now available to women in France. But the company has made a decision not to deliver any of these orders worldwide for fear of retribution, for fear of boycotts of its parent company, the Hex company in Germany. This is a very vivid example of the life and death nature of the politics of technology. That transition having been made, welcome to a talk about the politics of technology. Obvious examples like RU-486, and I think it is the premier example in our own day, are rather easy to understand. Langdon Winter, is this a little too loud? No. Langdon Winter was here last night. I was expecting the same crowd, and I see a lot of new faces, so I can't allude to that talk. But he also had a very obvious example of the politics of technology, his own homemade version of El Cortito, the short-handled hoe used by employers of farm workers in the Southwest. And it's a short-handled hoe. It requires people who work in the fields to bend down when they're doing their work so that supervisors can readily see who's working and who's not. One of my first ventures into high technology, this was when I was in junior high school. I was working in a supermarket, and my job was to clean the corners in the supermarket. The corners are where the floor and the wall meet. And if you think about a supermarket, there are a lot of those. And they had to be clean. And the technique for cleaning them was to take a Brillo pad and get on your hands and knees and walk around the floor of the supermarket for 2 hours cleaning the corners. Inventive like I am, I decided that I could improve upon this. And I put the Brillo pad on the end of a mop stick. Okay? And it did make my task much easier. And then I was stopped by my employer, who insisted on being called Mr. Majors, Sir, his Army training. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Look at this, saves time, more efficient. My knees might carry me into my 40s if I do this, and it's high technology." And he forced me to remove the Brillo pad from the handle and get back down on my knees. That was my introduction into the politics of technology. The man was less impressed with the gains in efficiency, and of course not at all impressed in the advantages for me, as he was in the maintenance of our relationship. Our relationship, which was best expressed with me on my knees and him standing lording over me. Langdon last night talked about the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th century, and he said that the social relations that were created in the wake of the Industrial Revolution outlived the technology. The machinery rusted became obsolete, but the social relations remained. Those who were here last night might remember that. I fundamentally disagree with that formulation. The Industrial Revolution came after the change in social relations. The relationship between people had been transformed. We're talking about a system called capitalism, and it's not a system of production, by the way, it's a system of domination. The relations of that system had been established before any advances in machinery. The factory system had been established before the steam engine, before automatic equipment, and only afterwards was the technology introduced designed to fit those social relations and to reinforce them. That is, the social relations determine the technology, not the other way around. And once the technology exists, it reinforces those relations. That's the formulation I'd like to suggest is operating here. This talk is supposed to be about values. I've never figured out what values means. But I guess it means people's preferences about the good, as well as the more material interests. To me, this is a matter of politics. The question is not which values inform technology. The question is whose values inform technology. And I'd like to suggest, and the historical record is absolutely clear on this, the values which inform technological design and deployment are the values of those who have the power to choose, to decide about the design and deployment of technology. And as I suggested, once the technology comes into being, it reinforces those values. Now, when we talk about RU-486, or struggles over pesticides, or nuclear power, the politics of technology is quite obvious, or El Cortito, or me and my invention, which, by the way, has never been patented, and I offer it to public domain. This for cleaning the corners. I went, by the way, back to that supermarket not long ago, and there's someone on their hands cleaning the corners. This was just 2 years ago. So there's a lot of room for innovation. The political nature of technology is obvious in these cases, but in most cases, it's less obvious. It's obvious because the values, the interests, the preferences, the concerns, the compulsions, the fantasies, the enthusiasms of people who decide on technology are rarely articulated. They're rarely explicit. They're ideological by and large, and what that means is they are assumed. They are habitual. They are pre-reflective. We don't think about them. These are the ones that are hard to get at, and that's what I'll be talking about mostly today. We tend to have a what I call a Darwinian view of technological development, except in these obvious cases where things are very visible. We tend to think of technology evolving in a process akin to natural selection. There are scientists, engineers who possess a kind of rationality, technical rationality we can call it, and their business is to figure out the best possible solution to a given problem. They come up with their solution. It's not always really perfect because they tend to be enthusiasts, as we know, and scientists tend to be a little weird, you know. But happily, there is a mechanism to correct for these excesses known as the bottom line in our culture, the no-nonsense, hard-headed businessman, who I've never met, by the way. Every businessman I've ever met is an enthusiast, a fantasist. But this is the theory. And the businessman looks at the technology and says, that will work, that won't make me any money, that will, I'll take that. Okay? And so there's a screening process. Well, like I said, not all businessmen are that astute or that shrewd or that ruthless or that calculating. But happily, there's another mechanism, which we call the market. And the market corrects for the mistakes of the businessman. Those who don't select the best technologies go out of business. So a guarantee through a process of selection, technical rationality, business acumen, the logic of accumulation, the self-regulating, self-correcting mechanism of the market, we're guaranteed that at the end of this process, only the best will survive. So when we stroll into a factory, that is, if we get past the barbed wire and the security system, we see a piece of machinery, we assume that that's the best that history had to offer. It's the latest. We're getting a new piece of equipment. And it's gone through this whole process. In reality, that machine is no different from a piece of legislation. You hear about a bill in Congress or in the State House, and you ask elementary political questions. What does the bill say? What does the bill mean? Who wrote the bill? Who owns the person who wrote the bill? Elementary political questions. That is, whose interests are being served by the bill? When we look at a piece of machinery, we tend not to ask the same questions. We say, ooh, look, a new machine, a red one. Isn't it fantastic? We don't look at it in the same way we look at a piece of legislation and say, who designed that machine? What were their interests? Who owns the people who design? That might sound offensive to people, but you understand what I'm talking about. Politicians are bought. They're not sold; they sell themselves. They're just sold to voters. In reality, as any engineer will tell you, the design of a piece of equipment, whether it's this watch or, as I'll be talking about, industrial equipment, is the result of a process of design according to specifications. Everything is designed that way. Anyone knows that if you think about it for a second. What are the criteria? This machine has to fit into a room 12 by 12, for example. Okay, so we know it can't be too big. This machine is to perform this function. This machine is to cost such and such. Okay. I'm being, these are gross chapter headings. But everything that's designed has detailed specifications. So the question, whose specifications are these? It's a political question. Who writes the criteria? Is anyone here studying engineering? Okay. Well, you know what an engineer does. An engineer follows orders. An engineer is a soldier, okay? An engineer goes to work and an engineer is told what to do. You design the straps, Make sure you can get 11 holes on here, okay? And if you're really a genius, you'll figure out how to do it. The specifications are given to you. You don't think them up. The problem is that these details, these specifications, once the thing comes into existence, are forgotten. And so it takes a lot of work to go back, sort of before the fact, so to speak, and tease out the values that are embedded in this mute piece of machinery. Now, what I'd like to do is talk primarily about class relationships and how the relationships of class are reflected in machinery, and I'll be very concrete here for a minute. Tedious, perhaps, talking about a particular technology. And then I'm also going to talk about sexual relations and how that might come in. First, let's talk a little about class. As I said, the system of capitalism, and I'm talking about capitalism because that's the system that we live in, is not a system of production. That's some bad propaganda that came down in the 18th and 19th century. It's a relationship of domination, okay? And at its core is a peculiar relationship in which one person can own, actually rent, another person's labor, okay? That's what happens when you go and you work for someone, you get a job, you know, and you get a salary or a wage. What are you giving in return? You're giving your labor. The person is buying it. How do you buy labor? You don't say, okay, here's my labor, see ya. Okay? Because it's integral with who you are. Okay? You can't say, here are my hands, see you at 5, because they're stuck. Okay? You can't say, here's my head, because you come with it. So how is labor sold, labor power? Because we're not talking about a system of slavery. It's rented over time. So you say, here I am, my back, my legs, my hands, my head, my eyes, my ears. Here it is for 8 hours. And just to make sure that I can get someone to rent me, I write up a thing called a resume. Has anyone ever written up a resume? Don't they teach you how to do resumes here? When you write a resume and you finish it and it's perfect and you got it on the laser printer, you know, it comes out and you read it. Is that you? Is that you? Here I am. It's not you, is it? Who is it? It's you as a commodity. Okay? And we're talking about this relationship is the sale of a commodity, which is your potential for labor. Now, if you're designing a piece of equipment for yourself, let's say you're a handy person, you fix your house or something like that, or you like to build things, you design machines that will help you do a task, improve the quality, perhaps relieve some strain, some fatigue, make things easier for you, enlarge the scope for your creativity, enlarge the scope for your power, your control over the finished product. And in fact, when we look at industrial machinery, and I'll be talking about machine tools, I'll explain that in a minute, the history of that machinery is pretty much the history of people designing machines for themselves, the early history of it. And the introduction of the slide rest, the introduction of various apparatus. If you try to understand it, it made the task easier for the person who's doing it. Now, if you're designing a piece of equipment not to be used by yourself, but to be used by the labor that you're renting, the machinery will look different. As I said, when you go to work for someone and you're renting your hands or your head, or you come with it, and that's a real problem for the person doing the renting. Because the person doing the renting wants to make the most use of his or her investment in you? Great, I have you from 9 to 5. How can I put you, this labor potential, to use most effectively to serve me? Right? You ever work like in a shoe store or a restaurant or something like that, and there's no customers, so you sit down, and your boss says, hey, why don't you dust in the back while you work in a restaurant? And they say, well, there's no one here. Well, why don't you take this opportunity to clean out the freezer or keep busy? Okay. And you do it. Why? Because you need the job. But also because you understand this person owns your time. And the person is trying to make the maximum use of your time. Okay? The relationship on the part of the employer is very simple. The first priority that the employer has above everything else, and please forget the idea of productivity. I mean, that's all nonsense. No one's interested in productivity. The main concern is to stay the employer. Okay? You don't go to work and say, okay, it's Monday, I'm the worker, and then tomorrow I'm the boss. We're rotating. What would happen if you suggest that to your boss? You think he'll take you up on it? No. The maintenance of the relationship, just like Mr. Masters, sir, is trying to maintain his relationship with me, okay? The maintenance of the relationship takes priority over everything else. So the values, to come back to this, the values are not as the person who would design a machine for himself to enhance his creativity or his control or his leisure. The values that inform the design are exactly the opposite. The values are to discipline the worker, both in the sense of making sure that the person is busy, and also in the sense that the person is not in any way going to endanger the relationship. To de-skill the employee. What I mean by de-skill is simply, this is also very simple, to make the task as simple as possible in order to cheapen the rental. If the task is highly skilled, the supply of people who can do the job is restricted and their price goes up. If you can make the task very simple, the pool of possible people who can do that simple job increases, and the price of the rental goes down. Okay? The de-skilling thing is also important in terms of maintaining the relationship. If your boss comes over to you and says, why don't you do 100 more of those? And you possess the skill to determine what's possible. You say, cannot be done. It's not humanly possible to do another 100 of those. Okay? If the boss possesses all the skill, and this is the history of what's called scientific management, he can tell the worker who doesn't possess the skill, do 100 more of those. That is, there's less leverage for the worker because of the relative lack of knowledge. Discipline, de-skilling, and the third thing is displacing. You've probably all heard the phrase labor-saving technology. Labor-saving technology is an ambiguous term because of the double, at least, meaning of the word labor in our culture. Labor-saving can mean, and this is what we often think of, reducing drudgery, reducing toil, reducing the amount of effort required to do a job. Great. We've introduced some labor-saving technology, such as the power drill, which saves your arm. Okay? Labor-saving technology. You can drill holes all day and, well, more or less not collapse. Okay? And if you ever tried to drill holes without a power drill, it's much harder. Okay? Labor-saving technology. And when we hear the phrase labor-saving technology, that's what we think about. And when engineers are put to work designing labor-saving technology, that's what they think about too. And they say, isn't this fantastic? I am serving the species. Okay? The species who have now begun to regain paradise. Okay? Overcoming the need to survive by the sweat of their brow. But now there's another meaning of labor-saving technology, and it goes back to the relationship I just talked about. Labor doesn't only mean your own capacity to work. Okay? In the capitalist relationship, labor means someone else's capacity to work. Okay? It means the labor bill. So labor-saving technology for the employer does not mean reducing of drudgery for the worker. It means eliminating the worker. Something very different. And in fact, in the wake of labor-saving technology in the last 30 years, the work week in the United States has increased, not decreased. In 40 years of labor-saving automation, the intensification and hours of work have increased for labor, not decreased. There were whole forests sacrificed to debates in the 50s and 60s about the threat or the specter of leisure with all this automation. Okay? And if you go into a plant or a union hall today and offer a 40-hour week, okay, people will think you're a utopian. Because labor-saving technology is designed in the context of this relationship I described, not to save labor drudgery, but to save capital labor. Okay, I mentioned discipline, de-skilling, displacing. Now, where do engineers come in? Engineers, some of my best friends are engineers. I've always taught in engineering schools. Wonderful people, decent people, honest people. And they're honest because at some point there's a moment of truth. You drive a car over the bridge that was designed and it falls or it doesn't. Okay? There are some of us in other disciplines that never have a moment of truth, and so we can wax on nonsensical without limit. There is a greater honesty when you're dealing with the material world. Why do engineers, in their practice, subscribe to the values of some citizens and not others? Why do they subscribe to the values of the employer and not the employee? And I use the word citizens. I mean, we are all citizens, you know. And when you go to work, you tend to forget that because it doesn't apply in the workplace. Well, there are a number of reasons for this. First and foremost, engineers go to work for employers. They don't go to work for workers. And their affinity, their intimate bond with their employers begins long before they actually go to work in schools like this. Okay. Engineering education is education in management. Okay. I used to teach at MIT in a graduate program, and I'll never forget an experience. We were doing a study of liquefied natural gas, which is a very volatile substance, and it was at the time imported from Algeria into Boston. And so the students were asked to do a study of what would happen if one of these tankers, by the way, right by the airport, planes taking off right over it and landing, what would happen if one of these tankers was destroyed somehow and this stuff leaked out? And they did dispersion models of a cloud over Boston, the greater Boston area, and then a spark would ignite it, and it would be like a firestorm like Dresden. And you could hear some of the faculty say, "Oh, good, not Wellesley. Hasn't come that far, you know." But the students, being hard-nosed, earnest engineers, really did a thorough job on this study. They spent a whole semester. Their job was to figure out safety regulations for the transportation of LNG. It came in on a boat, then it was put into tanks, like a tank farm, and then it was put into trucks, and then it was trucked around New England. Yeah. They talked to all the local officials, the state officials, and federal, using my phone all the time in my office. One wanted to call Algeria. They talked to the distributors. They talked to the warehousing. And they came up with their report at the end of the semester, and it was impeccable, with one exception. When they were done, I said, "Let me ask you a question. When this stuff is trucked around New England, over the troubled roads of New England, and something goes wrong, there's a crash, the truck driver is the first to hear about it. How come you didn't talk to any truck drivers?" Now, the truck drivers happen to be organized into the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers and the Teamsters, and they both have offices in Boston. And the students were embarrassed. And they said, "Well, I don't know, I never thought about it." Langdon Winter said last night a similar thing. "Why didn't you talk to workers?" "Oh, I never thought about it." They never thought of talking to the people most immediately affected by any accident. Why didn't they think of talking to them? Because these people are on another planet. Okay? At MIT, and perhaps here also, you could probably, within 2 days, establish a personal, even intimate relationship with people in a far-flung industry, okay? At MIT, if I wanted to go to see someone at TRW, they'd say, "Oh yeah, Joe Schmo an MIT grad works at TRW, here's his number," okay? There was no such network with labor. So there's this distance, okay, that's built in. The other thing is, as I said, the engineering education reinforces the attitudes. Let me give you an example. It's ideological. It's never articulated. It's never conscious. Engineers are dreamers. They want to do things. They want to make things. They want to make things happen. So they go to those who have the power to indulge them in their reverie. Okay? The people who can give them the power to dream. The people who can give them the power to dream expansively. Okay? The people who can give them the power to make their dreams come true by imposing them on other people. So suppose I'm an engineer and I've just developed this fantastic system for designing a certain product. It's the latest socio-technical system, the latest components, and it will put America #1 again. Okay? And I say to you, I appeal to you, you all can be a piece of this action, okay? Just do exactly what I say, when I say it, for as long as I say it. Okay? Don't ask any questions. Just do what I say. It's perfect. It's airtight. Okay? It works. Trust me. And then I start trotting this stuff out. And someone says, well, what about, shh, don't worry, it's taken care of. Just do what I said. Someone else raises an objection, and I say, look, do you want this or not? This is the way it works. Okay? It's fixed. After a while, the more enthusiastic I get, the more you'll recognize that I'm a little loony, and maybe someone will drag me out and give me a beer or something like that and try and sober me up. Because I wouldn't really have any way of getting you to comply with the specifications of the system. That is, to do what I said. If I took that exact same design and went down the road to Ford, or General Motors, or DuPont, or Unisys, or Lockheed, they'd say, this guy's a genius. This system is incredible. All of a sudden, this crazy design would become viable in the context, an authoritarian context, where people are forced to do what they're told. So I would give this design to this pharaoh of industry. Okay? My dream would come true. And the reason is because the derivative power derived by my association, I can get the people to do exactly as the design requires. Okay? Let me turn it around. Suppose, instead of just dragging me out, you tried to educate me. You said, look, Dave, you're a lunatic. We all, it's a free country.